Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Marriage, Tudor Style, Love, Hate and Scandal by Sylvia Barbara Soberton. Narrated by Julia Anthony. Introduction. While the flamboyant exploits of King Henry VIII and his 6 marriages, marked by divorces and beheadings, are well known, his matrimonial misadventures are but a single chapter in the broader narrative about Tudor marriages. Many courtiers found themselves entangled in a delicate dance between love, duty, and politics. The allure of an heir, the pursuit of power and money, and the whims of passion shaped the fates of those who entered the sacred bonds of matrimony. This book unravels the stories of Tudor courtiers whose marriages created scandals, from the royal affair of the married Anne Hastings to the marriage of Lettice Knowles to Robert Dudley that caused Elizabeth I to brand Lettice as a she-wolf. Each union is a chapter in a riveting saga of desire, scandal, betrayal, and the quest for love. As we delve into the chapters of marriage, Tudor style, love, hate and scandal, we peel back the layers of time to reveal the complexities and challenges faced by those who sought happiness in the shadow of the capricious Tudor monarchs. Chapter 1. Marriage, Tudor Style. Marriage in Tudor England was a legal transaction between families and was often referred to as a bargain. The key issue during negotiations was settling the size of the future bride's dowry and jointure. A woman's father or male relative agreed to offer a dowry, a specific amount of money in cash or instalments paid to her husband or to his legal guardian if he was a minor. The dowry was a woman's share of her father's estate and was often called a portion. Once the dowry was paid, it belonged to the husband, and a woman had no further claim on it. In return for the wife's dowry, the prospective husband and his family agreed to make a legal provision for the prospective wife in the event of his death. This provision was called a jointure, and typically involved the allocation of specific assets, such as land or money, to the wife as a form of financial support and security after the husband's passing. The purpose of a jointure was to ensure that the widow would have some form of independent income or property to sustain herself after her husband's death. Jointures, which provided a level of financial protection for women who might otherwise be left without sufficient resources in the absence of their husbands, were often specified in marriage contracts and were legally binding arrangements. The specific terms and assets involved in a jointure could vary based on individual agreements, social status of the married couple, and customs of the time. The main exception to the pattern of exchange of jointure for dowry occurred when the bride was an heiress. If a great lord had no sons, he could appoint his daughter as heiress suo jure in her own right. In this case, it was the groom's family that paid the family of the bride. The main objective of the family of the heiress was to guarantee the size of her inheritance. Under ecclesiastical law, girls under the age of 12 and boys under the age of 14 could not make legally binding matches. Forced marriages were strictly forbidden by the Church, and parents who arranged marriages for their children made sure that the young couple liked each other. However, aristocratic women married against their will, or alleged they had married against their will with some frequency. Love was not a priority in an aristocratic marriage, but it was hoped that the bride and groom would find each other agreeable, and that love would blossom between them eventually. The main objective of a marriage was to produce children. A widespread belief in the medieval and early modern world was that in order to conceive, it was necessary for a woman to climax. Virginity and widowhood were perceived as dangerous to a woman's health, because such women had no legitimate sexual partner and were in danger of becoming ill for lack of orgasm. Chastity was required for first-time brides, but was not necessary for first-time grooms. consummating a marriage deemed it indissoluble in the eyes of both God and the law. If a husband was considerably older than his wife, he was advised to wait until the girl reached puberty, so as not to put her in danger of early childbirth. This was the case when Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, who was in his early 50s, married heiress Catherine Willoughby, who was about 16 when she gave birth to the couple's first child in 1534. If the couple were of the same or similar age, consummation was advisable. During the Blackfriars trial in 1529, when the matter of Catherine of Aragon's virginity was weighed at court, George Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, believed that the match between Catherine and Arthur, Prince of Wales, must have been consummated because Arthur was 15, and Shrewsbury consummated his marriage when he was that same age. Sex was acceptable only within the marriage, and adultery was frowned upon within society. If a married woman committed adultery, the legitimacy of her children could be open to doubt. During Henry VIII's reign, Parliament passed 2 private bills punishing 2 adulterous women, Anne Parr and Elizabeth Owen Burrough, by declaring their children illegitimate. Henry VIII, although married, had several recorded mistresses, who were usually young and unmarried ladies serving his queens. The Church was clear that adultery was a sin, but there were various degrees of adultery. A double adultery occurred between 2 married people. If a married man took a mistress who was a single woman, it was deemed a single adultery, while some medieval thinkers opined that sex between a married man and an unmarried woman was not adultery. When Henry VIII sired a child with his unmarried mistress, Bessie Blount, there was no scandal, because Bessie was single and there was no question over the paternity of her son. The king acknowledged the boy as his and named him Henry Fitzroy. Historian Rebecca Holdorf explained, sex with a married woman was a pointed insult to her husband because it deprived him of this property, his exclusive right to sex with his wife, and wounded his pride. A married woman's lover also cast his own masculinity in doubt through his lack of self-control, a key characteristic of masculinity, and the disrespect it showed. If his mistress was unmarried, however, there was no husband to insult. A scandal of epic proportions erupted in 1510, when Henry VIII was rumoured to have taken a married woman as his mistress, although the affair was not conducted between Anne Hastings and the king, as is usually assumed, but between Lady Hastings and William Compton, one of the highest officials at court. Aristocratic Tudor women had to live up to unrealistic standards. They needed to fit the cast of an ideal woman, a paragon of virtue, pious and devoted to Christ. They had to be educated, but not too clever, assertive, but not intimidating. Women who served within the royal household were ornaments of the court, partaking in revels, banquets and stately occasions. Courtly love was highly fashionable, and women were expected to play their parts by responding to male attention, but without inviting too much familiarity. Young and unmarried maids of honour often fell prey to courtiers' lust, like the teenaged Elizabeth Brooke, who was seduced by William Parr. Trapped in a loveless marriage, Parr indulged in sexual affairs with women at court, being a man very well versed in the more delightful sort of studies as music, love toys, and other courtly dalliances. In 1536, the imperial ambassador, Chapuis, scoffed that it was almost impossible for Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, to be a virgin in a court where she was surrounded by people indulging in all forms of courtly love. Divorce, as we think of it today, did not exist in Tudor England. Henry VIII never divorced any of his wives. He always sought annulments, although the word divorce and annulment were used interchangeably in contemporary documents relating to his marital misadventures. If an annulment was sought, the spouses had to prove that their marriage had never been valid in the first place, and persuade the church to annul their union. The following grounds were usually used as basis for a divorce: lack of consent, a level of consanguinity or affinity that had not been properly dispensed, a pre-contract by one party to someone else, non-consummation, or insanity of one of the spouses at the time of the marriage. Henry VIII famously annulled his marriage to Catherine of Aragon based on a forbidden degree of affinity, because she was his late brother's widow, although Catherine maintained until the end of her life that her first marriage had never been consummated. The king's second marriage to Anne Boleyn was annulled based on his previous sexual relationship with her sister. His fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled based on the non-consummation issue. A legal separation, from bed and board, was granted to married couples and allowed them to live separately, but remarriage was out of the question in such cases. Only the death of a spouse could legally end the marriage. England was the only Protestant country not to introduce divorce during the 16th century Reformation. At the end of the 17th century, divorce by private act of Parliament became available for a select few. It was only in 1857 that the Divorce Act and its creation of judicial divorces extended the possibility more broadly. William Parr, Marquis of Northampton, obtained the only parliamentary divorce of 16th century England in 1552, divorcing his first wife Anne Bourchier and legalising his second marriage to Elizabeth Brooke. Seeking royal permission to contract aristocratic marriages was the norm at the Tudor court. Henry VIII had personally arranged marriages for at least two of his former mistresses, Bessie Blount and Margaret Skipwith, and took a keen interest in the marital history of his courtiers. In 1536, the king took drastic measures to regulate who could marry women of royal blood, after Margaret Douglas, one of his nieces, married secretly without his approval. Punishment for disobedience was often harsh. Margaret Douglas and Lord Thomas Howard were both imprisoned in the Tower of London, and whereas Margaret was later released into house arrest, Howard died within the Tower's walls, greatly mourned by his friends and family. Mary Carey, sister of Anne Boleyn, incurred her family's wrath when she remarried below her rank, without their knowledge and consent, in 1534, writing to Thomas Cromwell to help her regain their favour. Mary I, Henry VIII's elder daughter, enjoyed contributing financially to her maids of honour's dowries, and presented herself as the guardian of the holy bonds of matrimony. During her first parliament, Mary proclaimed the marriage of her parents, dissolved by Henry VIII in 1533, as valid, and herself as their legitimate child. During the same session, the Queen reversed William Parr's parliamentary divorce, and pardoned him for his involvement in attempting to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, under the condition of taking his first wife back. Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudor monarchs, refused to marry and produce children, and encouraged the same stance among her serving women. She desired her maids to remain in virgin state as much as may be, and favoured those who either never married or refused to remarry, most notably Blanche Parry and Dorothy Stafford. Many historians ascribe Elizabeth's rages over the marriages of her servants to sexual jealousy, but it is far more accurate to say that she guarded her royal prerogative of granting permission to marry in order to retain power over her courtiers. One marriage angered Elizabeth more than others, that of her Master of the Horse and personal friend, Robert Dudley, to her widowed kinswoman, Lettice Devereux, Countess of Essex. This was a personal blow to the Virgin Queen's heart, because she loved Dudley, but refused to become his wife, hoping that he would remain unmarried and devoted to her. Yet Dudley, like Elizabeth's royal father, sought to prolong his lineage by siring a male heir. For commoners, a marriage ceremony took place at the church's door, but aristocratic couples usually married in the royal chapel, often with the king or queen attending, and making a symbolic offering at the altar. Henry VIII attended the weddings of his favourite courtiers, such as Sir Henry Guilford in April 1512, Sir Nicholas Carew in December 1514, Henry Courtenay in October 1519, William Carey in February 1520, and Sir John Wallop in June 1531, making an offering at the altar of 6 shillings and 8 pence each time. Marriage was created by a freely given exchange of vows. The wedding vows of Henry VIII and his 6th wife Catherine Parr were based on the Sarum Manual and were recorded by a contemporary witness. Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, officiated at the wedding on 12th of July 1543 and asked for the couple's voluntary consent to the match. After both gave their consent with a hearty yea, the king took Catherine's right hand and repeated the following words after the bishop. I, Henry, take thee, Catherine, to my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death us depart, and thereto I plight thee my troth. Then, releasing, and again clasping hands, Catherine likewise said, I, Catherine, take thee, Henry, to my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to be bonny and buxom in bed and at board, till death us depart, and thereto I plight unto thee my troth. The exchange of the wedding rings and offering of gold and silver to the church followed next, and the bishop offered a prayer and benediction, ending the religious part of the ceremony. To Tudor men and women, marriage was not an appalling fate, but a career. To be unmarried was unthinkable. The purpose of marriages was gaining new allies and property, and the birth of children to continue the bloodline. Most arranged marriages turned into love matches or comfortable companionships, but some, like those described in this book, became scandalous and gossiped about at court and abroad. This is the story of the Tudor court as you have never experienced it before, through the eyes of the people who were deemed scandalous by society at large. Chapter 2. George Hastings and Anne Stafford. In May 1510, the court of young Henry VIII was rocked by scandal. Don Luis Queiroz, Spanish ambassador at the English court, reported that what lately has happened is that 2 sisters of the Duke of Buckingham, both married, lived in the palace. The one of them is the favourite of the Queen, and the other, it is said, is much liked by the King, who went after her. Edward Stafford, 3rd Duke of Buckingham, was among the highest-ranking peers at court. He was related to the King through his mother, Catherine Woodville, the youngest sister of Henry VIII's grandmother, Elizabeth. The Duke's father had been executed in 1483, after his failed rebellion against Richard III. Buckingham had 2 sisters. Elizabeth Stafford Radcliffe, Lady Fitzwalter, was among the principal ladies-in-waiting of Queen Catherine of Aragon. The younger sister Anne had been married to George Hastings since December 1509. It was Anne Hastings who apparently caught the King's wandering eye. She is often said to have been Henry VIII's first recorded mistress. However, as the Spanish ambassador noted, another version is that the love intrigues were not of the King, but of a young man, his favourite, of the name of Compton, who had been the late King's butler. This Compton was William Compton, Henry VIII's groom of the stool and personal friend. Louis Queiroz believed that this Compton carried on the love intrigue, as it is said, for the King, and that is the more credible version, as the King has shown great displeasure at what I am going to tell. The ambassador went on to describe the scandalous events that unfolded. Worried about her sister's reputation, Lady Fitzwalter joined herself with the Duke of Buckingham. her brother with her husband and her sister's husband, in order to consult on what should be done in this case. The consequence of the counsel of all the four of them was, Carol's reported, that, whilst the Duke was in the private apartment of his sister, who was suspected of intriguing with the King, Compton came there to talk with her, saw the Duke, who intercepted him, quarrelled with him, and the end of it was that he was severely reproached in many and very hard words. The King was so offended at this that he reprimanded the Duke angrily. According to a later legend, the proud Duke bellowed that women of the Stafford family are no game for Comptons. No, nor for the Tudors either. This is, however, not a contemporary comment, but it reflects Buckingham's attitude towards his high rank. Buckingham left the court in a huff. At the same time, George Hastings, Anne's cuckolded husband, went away, carried her off, and placed her in a convent 60 miles from here, that no one may see her. Seeing Lady Anne Hastings gone, the King was so angry with Lady Fitzwalter that he banished her, together with her husband, from court. Henry VIII believed that Lady Fitzwalter employed more women of the Queen's household to spy and report back to the Queen, and wanted to dismiss more of them, but he perceived this would cause too great a scandal. The result of these events was that almost all the court knew that the Queen had been vexed with the King, and the King with her, and thus this storm went on between them. Historians usually assume that Lady Anne Hastings was guilty of adultery with the King, and describe her as Henry VIII's first recorded royal mistress. However, there appears to be more evidence that she was romantically involved with William Compton rather than with the King. All of Henry VIII's recorded mistresses were unmarried, which means that the King preferred to indulge in sexual affairs with unmarried women, to avoid creating rivalries with his courtiers. An undated document, preserved in the National Archives, sheds more light on this issue. In the document, originally written in Latin at an unknown date, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey cited Compton for adultery with Lady Anne Hastings during the life of his wife, and taking a holy sacrament to deny it, thus committing perjury. Adultery was a case for ecclesiastical courts, not for secular authorities, hence why Compton was cited by Wolsey. Why Wolsey decided to persecute one of the highest-ranking officials at Henry VIII's court is unknown, but nothing came of it, and neither Compton nor Lady Hastings were punished. It is possible that Wolsey cited Compton because the case was so well known and notorious, and some form of action from the royal authorities was expected. How long Anne remained at a convent is unknown, but she was soon reunited with her husband, who had apparently forgiven her. She was included in the customary gift exchange on New Year's Day in 1513, a clear sign that she was back at court. Anne's first child, son and heir Francis, was born in 1514. George never doubted his son's paternity, and Francis inherited the earldom of Huntingdon in 1544. George Hastings had apparently forgiven Anne for her affair with Compton. In 1528, he penned her an affectionate letter, referring to her as "mine own good Anne." Anne expressed worries about his health and wanted to nurse him with her own hands. George signed his letter as "Your true loving bedfellow, George Hastings." Lady Hastings, however, remained in William Compton's thoughts. When he made the first draft of his last will on 8th of March 1522, he mentioned Lady Hastings thrice in a highly unusual manner. First, he requested that my executors shall found, in my name, 2 chantries at Compton, for priests to perform daily service in praying for the souls of the King, Queen, and the Lady Anne Hastings, as also for my soul and the souls of my wife, my ancestors, and all Christian souls. He also made significant donations to several monasteries and charter houses, requesting that they perform a yearly obit forever for the souls of the King, the Queen, the Lady Anne, himself, his wife, his children, his ancestors, and all Christian souls. Finally, William left Anne a life interest in a piece of his land, an unusual legacy considering that Lady Hastings was not related to him. William Compton died of the sweating sickness that swept through England in June 1528. Anne outlived him and had a long, successful career at court. In December 1529, she became a countess when her husband was ennobled with the earldom of Huntingdon. She was named as executrix of George's will in 1534, a sign that she was highly esteemed by her husband. George Hastings died in 1544. The date of Anne's death is unknown, but she is often stated to have also died in 1544. In an interesting twist of fate, Anne's granddaughter Frances married Henry Compton, the grandson of William Compton. Chapter 3. Charles Brandon and Mary Tudor. Charles Brandon's claim to fame is the fact that he remained Henry VIII's devoted servant from the beginning almost to the end of the King's 38-year-long reign. Always at Henry's side, Charles was elevated from humble origins to the dukedom of Suffolk, but almost lost his good standing with the King when, in 1515, he married Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary Tudor, without the royal consent. Charles's marriage to Mary was not the only scandalous marriage he contracted. The dashing Duke of Suffolk had a rather checkered and unsavoury marital past to begin with. Charles Brandon's father, William, was Henry VII's standard-bearer during the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. He was slain by Richard III. Charles was subsequently given a post of honour at court, serving at the King's table. Serving at court, he fell in love with Anne Brown, and resorted much to her company. Anne was one of the 3 gentlewomen of honour who attended Queen Elizabeth of York. The Queen's privy purse expenses for the year 1503 show that Anne Brown received her wages for half a year ended at Michaelmas last past. The young Anne Brown reciprocated Charles Brandon's feelings and entered into a binding pre-contract in front of Charles's patron, the Earl of Essex. The pre-contract was sealed with consummation and was as binding as marriage. However, Charles soon decided to leave Anne and marry her aunt, Margaret Neville. Margaret was some 20 years older than Charles, and people at court sneered that Charles married her for her wealth. Breaking one's promise was seen as dishonourable, and Anne Brown soon made it clear that Charles Brandon was pre-contracted to her, and their match had been consummated, making their union indissoluble. Brandon's marriage to Margaret Neville was annulled after less than 2 years, and he secretly married Anne Brown in early 1508. The couple's first child, a daughter named Anne, who would have equally interesting marital misadventures, as you will see in the next chapter, may have been born either before Charles jilted Anne Brown for Margaret Neville around the year 1506, or after the couple's secret marriage. Charles was pressured by Anne's relatives to marry her publicly, and he did so around Easter of 1510. Poor Anne Brown was not Lady Brandon for long. She died in the summer of 1510, following the birth of her second child with Charles, Mary. Motivated by financial profit yet again, Brandon soon became engaged to a child bride, Elizabeth Grey, Viscountess Lisle in her own right. But there was never a marriage contracted between the two, due to Elizabeth's tender age. In the autumn of 1513, Charles made flirtatious overtures to the Archduchess Margaret of Savoy, daughter of Emperor Maximilian. During a meeting in Tournai, Charles snatched a ring from the Archduchess's finger, as was the romantic custom in England, but the Archduchess playfully scorned him by calling him a thief, and thus let him know that she would never agree to marry him. It was already well known that Brandon's marital situation was somewhat murky, but he wanted to marry the Archduchess.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?